Elena froze when she saw the young cleaner's earrings. They were the same ones her daughter Lucia was wearing when she disappeared 20 years ago. The afternoon sun, streaming through the lace curtains, cast dancing shadows on the polished wooden floor. From her favorite armchair, an antique piece with green velvet upholstery that once belonged to her grandmother, Elena watched this daily spectacle. Her fingers, slender and marked by age, absently stroked the frayed edge of the armrest. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall marked the rhythm of another solitary afternoon in the grand house on Almond Street. At 58, Elena Montero led a life many would envy. Widowed a decade ago, she had inherited not only her late husband's fortune, but also their majestic colonial-style home, which stood majestically in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. From the outside, the property was a testament to elegance and opulence, with a meticulously kept garden boasting rose bushes that erupted in cascades of color every spring, a marble fountain that whispered day and night, and a gravel path that snaked its way to the imposing carved oak front door. However, for Elena, every corner of this house held memories that swung between sweetness and the deepest sorrow. Closing her eyes for a moment, she let the familiar sounds wash over her. The gentle murmur of the fountain, the occasional bark of a dog in the distance, and the rustling of the branches of the old oak tree outside her window. They were the soundtrack of her life, a life that had grown incredibly quiet over the years. She rose slowly, her joints protesting with a soft creak, and walked towards the fireplace mantel. There, a collection of framed photographs told the story of a family that had once been happy and complete. Her eyes settled on one image in particular. A 5-year-old girl with a radiant smile and sparkling eyes held a red balloon on a sunny day at the park. It was Lucia. Elena's heart contracted painfully, as it always did when she looked at this photo. 20 years had passed since that fateful day when Lucia vanished without a trace, but the pain remained as fresh as if it were yesterday. Elena extended a trembling hand and caressed her daughter's face through the glass, allowing herself a moment to sink into her memories. That September morning had begun like any other. Elena had prepared breakfast for Lucia, toast with strawberry jam and a glass of milk with cocoa, her favorite. The girl had devoured her breakfast with the enthusiasm of a 5-year-old, chatting animatedly about the drawing she planned to do in art class. "Mommy, can I wear my blue dress today?" Lucia had asked, her big eyes pleading. Elena smiled, unable to resist that look. "Of course, honey, but remember you have to be careful not to stain it during art class." Lucia had nodded solemnly, promising to be careful. Elena helped her get dressed, combing her brown curls into 2 perfectly symmetrical pigtails. As a finishing touch, she put on the small gold hoop earrings she had received for her 5th birthday just a few weeks earlier. "Ready for school?" Elena asked, picking up Lucia's backpack. "Yes!" the girl exclaimed, jumping with excitement. The walk to school was short, barely 10 minutes. Elena held Lucia's hand tightly as they walked through the neighborhood streets, greeting neighbors and enjoying the fresh morning breeze. Upon reaching the school gate, Elena bent down to give her daughter a farewell kiss. "I love you, my love," she said. "Have a good day, and remember I'll pick you up when school's out." "I love you too, Mommy," Lucia replied, hugging her mother tightly before running into the building, her backpack bouncing cheerfully on her back. Elena watched her go, feeling that mix of pride and nostalgia that all mothers experience as they watch their children grow. She never imagined that would be the last time she saw her little girl. The memory of that day continued to torment Elena, replaying over and over in her mind like a worn film. What if she had insisted on accompanying Lucia to her classroom? What if she had arrived a few minutes earlier to pick her up? The unanswered questions haunted her day and night, fueling a guilt that never left her. Elena tore her gaze from the photograph and walked to the kitchen. The house, with its wide hallways and spacious rooms, seemed to amplify her loneliness. Every footstep echoed in the silence, reminding her how empty her life was without Lucia. In the kitchen, Elena set about making a cup of tea, a ritual she had adopted to calm her nerves in moments of greatest anguish. As the water boiled, her gaze wandered around the room. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, was a blend of classic elegance and modern amenities. Dark wood cabinets contrasted with stainless steel appliances, and a central marble island dominated the space. Elena remembered the countless mornings Lucia sat on one of the island stools, swinging her little legs as she ate breakfast and chattered about her dreams and plans for the day. Now those stools stood empty, silent witnesses to a happiness that had vanished. The whistle of the kettle snapped her out of her thoughts. With mechanical movements, Elena made her tea, adding a spoonful of honey the way she liked it. She carried the steaming mug back to the living room, pausing for a moment by the window overlooking the back garden. The garden, once filled with laughter and children's games, was now impeccable but devoid of life. Elena had kept the swing that Roberto, her late husband, had built for Lucia. It swayed gently in the breeze as if waiting for a little girl to come running to claim it. Roberto. The thought of her husband brought with it a fresh wave of sadness. He had been her rock, her unconditional support during the terrible days, weeks, and months that followed Lucia's disappearance. Together they had walked every street, spoken to every neighbor, and begged the police not to give up the search. Roberto had been the one to hold her when the weight of the loss threatened to crush her. But fate, cruel and relentless, had snatched Roberto from her too. A heart attack took him 10 years ago, leaving Elena completely alone with her pain. Sometimes she wondered if it had been the stress and grief that had finally taken their toll on Roberto's health. Guilt, that old companion, whispered that perhaps she had dragged him with her into her spiral of despair. Elena sat down in her armchair again, holding the cup of tea in her hands, seeking comfort in its warmth. Her eyes wandered around the room, lingering on the small details that spoke of an interrupted life. An empty photo frame on the side table, where a family picture had once stood. A shelf of children's books she hadn't had the heart to take down. A hand-embroidered cushion that Lucia had made in her crafts class, now faded with time. The sound of the doorbell startled Elena, making her almost spill her tea. Visits were infrequent these days. Her heart racing, she got up and went to the door. For a brief, crazy moment, as she did every time the doorbell rang, a part of her expected to see Lucia on the other side, smiling and explaining that it had all been a terrible misunderstanding. But when she opened the door, she found the kind, concerned face of her neighbor, Marta. "Elena, dear, how are you? I was passing by and thought I'd say hello." Elena forced a smile, grateful for Marta's concern, but longing for the solitude of her routine. "I'm fine, Marta. Thank you for asking. Would you like to come in for some tea?" Marta nodded, following Elena inside. As they walked towards the kitchen, Elena noticed Marta's gaze sweeping over the place, probably looking for signs of deterioration or neglect. She was aware that her neighbors worried about her, fearing that one day they would find her sunk in depression or worse. "The house looks impeccable, as always," Marta remarked as she sat down on one of the kitchen island stools. "It must be exhausting to keep it that way all by yourself. Have you thought about hiring some help? It's such a big house." "I'm fine like this, Marta," Elena interrupted, perhaps more abruptly than she intended. Softening her tone, she added, "I appreciate your concern. I really do. But I manage well on my own." Marta nodded, accepting the cup of tea that Elena offered her. I know, you're a strong woman, Elena. But sometimes a little company." Elena sat down opposite Marta, stirring her tea distractedly. "I have my routines, my little projects. I don't need anything else." The conversation drifted towards lighter topics. The weather, preparations for the upcoming neighborhood party, and the new rose bushes Marta had planted in her garden. Elena participated with monosyllables and polite smiles, grateful for the distraction, but eager to return to her solitude. When Marta finally said goodbye, promising to come back soon, Elena closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling a long sigh. These social interactions, although well-intentioned, left her exhausted. She preferred the company of her memories and her familiar ghosts. The rest of the afternoon passed like so many others. Elena busied herself with small household chores, folding freshly laundered clothes, watering the houseplants, and organizing the mail. Each activity was an attempt to keep at bay the dark thoughts that always lurked at the edges of her consciousness. As night fell, Elena made herself a simple dinner, a salad and a piece of toast. She ate in silence, seated at the dining room table designed to accommodate a large family. The empty chairs surrounding her seemed to mock her loneliness. After washing the dishes and leaving the kitchen spotless, Elena went to the study. This room, which had once been Roberto's refuge for his work and reading, now served as a sanctuary for Lucia's memories. Framed childhood drawings hung on the walls, preserved like priceless treasures. A small desk in the corner still held Lucia's notebooks and colored pencils, arranged as if the girl had just stopped drawing a few minutes ago, not 2 decades before. Elena sat down in the leather armchair that had belonged to Roberto, allowing herself to sink into its familiar embrace. From a nearby shelf, a photograph of her whole family gazed back at her. Roberto, Lucia, all smiles and carefree during a beach vacation. That picture perfectly captured the happiness they had once shared, a happiness that now seemed to belong to another life, another person. With a sigh, Elena reached for a photo album. It was a ritual she allowed herself from time to time, a painful journey through happy moments from the past. Each page was a treasure and a torture. Lucia on her first day of school, her backpack almost as big as she was. Lucia blowing out the candles on her 4th birthday, her cheeks puffed with the effort. Lucia and Roberto building a sandcastle, their laughter almost audible through the image. Tears began to fall silently as Elena caressed each photograph. She allowed herself to cry, letting the pain flow freely. It was in these moments, in the privacy of her sanctuary, that she allowed herself to be truly vulnerable. "My girl," she whispered between sobs. "Where are you? What happened to you?" The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Elena opened her eyes. As she did every morning, her first thought was for Lucia. She wondered, as she always did, if today would be the day she would finally find out what happened to her daughter. But as always, reality struck her with its cruel indifference. Today would be another day of waiting, another day of living with her heart in limbo. She got up slowly, her joints protesting with every movement. At 58, Elena felt as though she had lived several lifetimes, all of them marked by the absence of her little girl. She went to the bathroom, avoiding looking directly at the mirror. She knew what she would see: the face of a woman prematurely aged by grief, with eyes that had cried too much and wrinkles that spoke of sleepless nights. While she was brushing her teeth, her gaze drifted involuntarily towards a small shelf by the sink. There, in a glass cup, rested a child's toothbrush with a picture of a princess on it, Lucia's toothbrush. Elena had kept it, unable to part with it, as if doing so meant admitting her daughter would never use it again. She touched it gently with her fingertips, allowing herself a moment of weakness, before continuing with her morning routine. Downstairs in the kitchen, her footsteps echoed in the silence of the big empty house. She made coffee automatically, her movements mechanical after so many years of repetition. As the coffee brewed, Elena looked out the window at the back garden. The first rays of sun illuminated the swing Roberto had built for Lucia. It swayed gently in the morning breeze, as if waiting for a little girl to come running to sit on it. Elena looked away, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, her eyes wandering around the room. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, was a testament to an interrupted life. State-of-the-art appliances, contrasted with the children's drawings still stuck on the refrigerator, faded with time but impossible for Elena to take down. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts returned to the conversation she had had with Marta, her neighbor, a few days earlier. Marta's words echoed in her mind. "Haven't you thought about hiring some help? It's such a big house." At the time, Elena had rejected the idea almost automatically. The thought of having a stranger in her home, touching Lucia's things, disturbing the carefully preserved memories, seemed unbearable. But now, in the quiet of the morning, she found herself considering the possibility. The truth was, keeping up with the house was becoming increasingly difficult. Tasks she once performed effortlessly now took twice the time and energy. Cleaning the second-floor bedrooms left her breathless, and lately she had been putting off certain tasks simply because she didn't have the strength to do them. Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. Maybe Marta was right. Maybe it was time to accept some help. But the thought of interviewing strangers, of letting someone into her sanctuary of memories, filled her with anxiety. She finished her coffee and went to the study. This room, which had once been Roberto's workspace, now served as a kind of museum dedicated to Lucia. The walls were covered with photographs and drawings, and children's toys and books lined the shelves. Elena sat in Roberto's leather armchair, letting herself sink into its familiar embrace. Her eyes fell on the largest photograph on the wall. Lucia on her 5th birthday, grinning at the camera, her eyes bright with excitement. Elena remembered that day as if it were yesterday. They had organized a small party in the garden, with balloons and a chocolate cake. Lucia wore a blue dress that matched the small gold hoop earrings they had given her that same day. Elena closed her eyes, letting the memories envelop her. The sound of Lucia's laughter, the smell of freshly baked cake, the feeling of her daughter's small body in her arms as they sang happy birthday. It was at times like this, surrounded by memories of her daughter, that the pain of loss felt sharpest, most unbearable. But it was also in that moment, surrounded by memories of her daughter, that Elena made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't let the house, the last tangible link to Lucia, deteriorate because of her inability to properly care for it. Lucia deserved to have her home kept just as she remembered it, bright and full of life. With a determination she hadn't felt in years, Elena got up and went to the phone. She dialed Marta's number with trembling fingers. "Marta, it's Elena. Listen, I've been thinking about what you said the other day, and I think you're right. I need help with the house." Marta's voice on the other end of the line sounded surprised but pleased. "Oh, Elena, I'm so glad you reconsidered. I know a lovely young woman who would be perfect for the job. Do you want me to ask her to get in touch?" Elena felt a pang of anxiety but suppressed it. "Yes, please. Tell her she can come tomorrow afternoon, if that's okay with her." After hanging up, Elena sat down again, her heart pounding. She had just taken a huge step, one that would change her carefully constructed routine. But deep down, she knew it was necessary. It was time to allow a little new life into this house full of memories. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nerves and preparations. Elena threw herself into tidying and cleaning, even though she knew it was illogical. After all, that's what she was hiring someone for. But she needed to keep busy, to channel her anxiety into something productive. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, Elena paused in front of Lucia's closed bedroom door. She hadn't been in there for years, preserving the room exactly as Lucia had left it. With her heart in her throat, she turned the knob and stepped inside. The musty smell hit her immediately, mixed with a faint scent of lavender that lingered after all these years. The room was exactly as she remembered it. The bed with its princess bedspread, the desk with coloring books and pencils scattered about, the closet door slightly ajar, revealing small dresses that would never be worn again. Elena sat down on the bed, running a hand over the bedspread. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked around. "My girl," she whispered, "I hope you agree with this. I need help, honey. I can't keep going on like this." She stayed there for what seemed like hours, just sitting in the darkness, surrounded by memories of her daughter. When she finally got up to go to her own room, she felt strangely at peace, as if somehow she had obtained Lucia's silent blessing for this new chapter in her life. The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if the universe wanted to give Elena a boost. She got up early, more nervous than she had been in years. The young woman Marta had recommended was coming that afternoon, and Elena wanted to be prepared. She spent the morning cleaning frantically, although a part of her knew it was absurd. It wasn't like that was the reason she was hiring help. But she couldn't help it. The idea of a stranger judging the state of her house filled her with anxiety. At 3 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Elena jumped, even though she had been waiting for that sound all afternoon. She gave herself a quick once-over in the hallway mirror, smoothing her hair and straightening her blouse. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Before her stood a young woman in her early 20s, with brown hair pulled back in a casual ponytail and large, kind brown eyes. She wore jeans and a simple t-shirt and held a small bag in her hands. "Good afternoon," said the young woman with a shy smile. "I'm Sarah. Marta told me you were looking for some cleaning help." Elena froze for a moment. There was something about Sarah, about the way she smiled, about the warmth in her eyes that reminded her achingly of Lucia. She had to shake her head slightly to break free from her stupor. "Yes, yes, of course," she said at last, stepping aside to let Sarah in. "Please, come in." Sarah entered, her eyes taking in the house's interior with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Elena watched her closely, noting her every reaction, every gesture. It felt strange to have someone so young in the house after all this time. "It's a beautiful house," Sarah commented, turning to Elena with a smile. "It must be a challenge to keep it up." Elena nodded, feeling herself relax a little at the young woman's kindness. "It is. That's why I need help. I'm not as young as I used to be." Sarah smiled sympathetically. "Well, I'm here to help in any way I can. Where would you like me to start?" Elena led her through the house, showing her the different rooms and explaining the tasks that needed to be done. Sarah listened attentively, asking occasional questions and taking notes in a small notebook she had taken out of her bag. When they reached the second floor, Elena stopped in front of a closed door. This is my daughter's room," she said quietly. "It doesn't need cleaning." Sarah noticed the change in Elena's tone, the sudden tension in her shoulders. She didn't ask, but her gaze softened with understanding. "Of course, Mrs. Elena," she said. "I'll respect that." Elena felt a wave of gratitude toward the young woman. She hadn't asked any questions, hadn't shown any morbid curiosity. She had simply accepted the situation with respect and understanding. They finished the tour in the kitchen where Elena made tea for both of them. As they sat at the kitchen table, Elena surprised herself by telling Sarah about Lucia. She didn't go into details about her disappearance, but she talked about what her daughter had been like: cheerful, curious, always willing to help. Sarah listened attentively, her eyes full of compassion. "She sounds like a wonderful girl," she said softly when Elena paused. "You must be very proud of her." Elena felt tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. "I am," she said simply. After finishing their tea, they agreed on a schedule for Sarah to come 3 times a week. As the young woman got ready to leave, Elena found herself looking forward to her next visit. There was something about Sarah, a warmth and kindness, that made Elena feel less alone than she had in years. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Elena," Sarah said at the door. "See you Thursday." Elena watched her walk away down the driveway, a young, energetic figure that contrasted with the neighborhood's stillness. She closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. She had survived this first encounter, this first step towards change. That night, as she got ready for bed, Elena reflected on the day. Sarah's presence had brought a different energy to the house, a sense of possibility that Elena hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in years, she went to bed with a feeling of anticipation for the next day, instead of her usual resignation. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah arrived punctually each agreed-upon morning, bringing with her an energy and enthusiasm that gradually began to infect Elena. The young woman worked efficiently, cleaning and organizing, with a care that Elena deeply appreciated. But beyond her efficiency with household tasks, it was Sarah's presence that was having a more profound impact on Elena. The young woman had a way of moving around the house that didn't disturb the carefully preserved memories. Instead, she seemed to breathe new life into them. When she dusted the photo frames, she did it with a reverence that touched Elena. When she watered the plants, she spoke to them softly, as if sharing secrets. Summer had arrived in all its glory, bringing with it long, warm days that bathed Elena's house in golden light. Several months had passed since Sarah started working there, and her presence had become an integral part of Elena's routine. The house, once a silent mausoleum of memories, now vibrated with renewed energy. Elena woke up that morning with a sense of anticipation. It was Thursday, one of the days Sarah came to work. She got up with more vigor than she had felt in years, her movements fluid and purposeful as she got ready for the day. While brushing her hair in front of the bathroom mirror, she noticed that the deep lines of worry that had etched her face for so long seemed to have softened slightly. She went downstairs to the kitchen and started making breakfast. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, mingling with the scent of the fresh flowers Sarah had placed in a vase on the kitchen table the day before. Elena smiled at the sight, remembering how the young woman had enthusiastically picked them from the garden, explaining the meaning of each flower as she arranged them. The doorbell rang punctually at 9 o'clock. Elena opened the door to be met with Sarah's radiant smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Elena," the young woman greeted her, entering with her usual energy. "How are you today?" "Fine, Sarah, thank you," Elena replied, surprising herself by realizing she actually meant it. Would you like a cup of coffee before we start? Sarah nodded gratefully, following Elena to the kitchen. While they drank their coffee, they chatted about the day's plans. It was a routine they had naturally established. These quiet moments of conversation before Sarah started her tasks. Today I was thinking of tackling the attic, Sarah said, sipping her coffee. If that's all right with you, of course. I've noticed we haven't been up there since I started working here. Elena felt a pang of anxiety at the mention of the attic. It was the last refuge of the most painful memories, the place where she had stored Lucia's things that she couldn't bear to see every day, but couldn't bring herself to discard either. I don't know if that's necessary, Sarah, she said, trying to keep her tone casual. The attic is, well, it's quite messy. Sarah looked at her with understanding. During the months she had been working there, she had learned to read Elena's expressions, to understand her silences and her unspoken words. I understand, Mrs. Elena, she said softly, but perhaps it would be good to give it some fresh air, don't you think? I promise to be very careful with everything up there. Elena hesitated for a moment, but something in Sarah's sincere gaze convinced her. Perhaps it was time to face those memories, to allow fresh air and sunlight to enter that space that had been closed for so long. All right, she finally said, but let me come with you. There are things up there that are very important to me. Sarah nodded, her face lighting up with an understanding smile. Of course, Mrs. Elena. I'd love for you to come with me. They finished their coffee and headed toward the stairs that led to the attic. Elena felt her heart beating faster with each step. She hadn't been up there in years, consciously avoiding that space filled with painful memories. Sarah opened the attic door, and a cloud of dust danced in the light filtering through the small round window. The space was crammed with boxes, furniture covered in sheets, and miscellaneous objects accumulated over the years. Elena stepped inside slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. Every object seemed to hold a memory, each box the potential to unearth the pain she had been trying to keep at bay for so long. Where would you like to start, Mrs. Elena? Sarah asked softly, drawing Elena from her thoughts. Elena walked towards a stack of boxes in a corner. We can start here, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded and began to move the boxes carefully, wiping away the accumulated dust. Elena watched silently, her mind flooded with memories with each object that came to light. They spent the morning like that, literally dusting off the past. Sarah worked efficiently, but always with an eye on Elena, alert for any sign of distress. Occasionally, Elena stopped to explain the significance of a particular item. Lucia's first frame drawing, a photo album from a family vacation, the old teddy bear Lucia carried everywhere. It was close to noon when it happened. Sarah was cleaning a high shelf, stretching to reach the top. Elena was watching her, lost in thought, when a glint caught her attention. Time seemed to stop. In Sarah's ears, swaying gently as she stretched, was a pair of small gold hoop earrings. Earrings that Elena would recognize anywhere, anytime. Lucia's earrings. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. The world around her faded away, and all she could see were those small, gold hoops, identical to the ones she had given her daughter on her 5th birthday, the ones Lucia was wearing the day she disappeared. Sarah, Elena managed to say, her voice barely audible, your earrings. Sarah turned, surprised by Elena's tone. My earrings? She asked, instinctively touching them. What about them? Elena approached, her legs trembling so much she feared she might collapse. With shaky hands, she reached for Sarah's ears, gently touching the small hoops. Where did you get them? She asked, her voice breaking with emotion. Confused by Elena's reaction, Sarah replied, I've always had them. My adoptive mother told me I was wearing them when I was adopted. They're the only thing I have from my life before the adoption. Sarah's words hit Elena like a tidal wave. Adoptive mother. The only thing from her life before the adoption. Lucia's earrings. It all swirled in her mind, pieces of a puzzle that were suddenly falling into place. Oh my God, Elena whispered, her legs finally giving way. She sank down onto an old chair, her face ashen. Alarmed, Sarah knelt before her. Mrs. Elena, what's wrong? Are you all right? Elena looked at Sarah, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. How hadn't she noticed before? Sarah's eyes, her smile, the way she tilted her head when she was concentrating. It all screamed Lucia. "Sarah," Elena began, her voice trembling with each word. "Those earrings belong to my daughter, to Lucia. I gave them to her on her 5th birthday. She was wearing them the day she disappeared." Sarah's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and confusion on her face. But, but that can't be. I, I was adopted when I was very young. My parents. How old are you, Sarah? Elena asked, although deep down she already knew the answer. 25, Sarah answered automatically, still trying to process what was happening. Elena did a quick mental calculation. 25 years. Lucia would be 25 years old now. The dates fit perfectly. "Sarah," Elena said, taking the young woman's hands in hers, I think you might be my Lucia." The silence that followed those words was deafening. Sarah sat motionless, her face a mask of shock and confusion. Elena could see the whirlwind of emotions in the young woman's eyes, so similar to her Lucia's. But that's impossible," Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "My parents, they adopted me when I was a baby. They told me they found me." "Where?" Elena asked softly. "Where did they find you?" Sarah blinked, trying to recall the stories she had been told so many times. In a park. They told me they found me on a park bench, wearing these earrings, and with a note that just said my name. Sarah. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. The park, the same park where Lucia had disappeared. It was all starting to come together in a way that was both terrifying and wonderful. "Sarah," Elena began, struggling to keep her composure. "My Lucia disappeared from a park. She was 5 years old. She was wearing those same earrings you have now. And the dates would match up with when you were adopted." Sarah stood abruptly, taking a few steps back. Her face was a mix of emotions, confusion, fear, hope, all blending into an expression that tore at Elena's heart. "This can't be," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Elena. "My parents, they love me. They raised me. They can't have—" "Sarah," Elena interrupted softly, rising with difficulty. "I'm not suggesting your parents did anything wrong. It's possible they really did find you and adopt you without knowing you were my Lucia." Sarah looked at her, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. But if that's true, what happened? How did I end up in that park? Why?" Elena took a step towards Sarah, longing to embrace her but holding back. "I don't know, honey. I don't know what happened that day. I've spent the past 20 years asking myself the same thing. But now maybe we can figure it out together." Sarah brought her hands to her head, as if trying to contain all the thoughts and emotions threatening to spill over. This is too much. I need to think. I need to talk to my parents." Elena nodded, understanding Sarah's confusion and fear. "Of course I understand this is a shock for you. Take all the time you need. But Sarah, please don't disappear. I couldn't bear to lose you again." Sarah looked at her, and for a moment, Elena saw in her eyes the little Lucia she had lost so long ago. "I won't disappear," Sarah said softly. "I'll be back, I promise. I need to process all of this." Elena nodded, fighting the urge to embrace Sarah, to never let her go again. "I'll be waiting," she said simply. Sarah gathered her things silently, her movements mechanical, as if she were operating on autopilot. Before leaving the attic, she turned to Elena one last time. "Mrs. Elena," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'll be back, I promise." And with that, she was gone, leaving Elena alone in the attic, surrounded by memories of the past and the promise of a future she never dared to imagine. Elena stood motionless for what seemed like hours, listening to the sound of the front door closing, the engine of Sarah's car starting up, driving away. When she finally moved, it was to sink heavily onto the old chair, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. How was it possible, after so many years, after so much searching and so much pain, that her Lucia might have been so close all this time? Elena recalled every moment she had spent with Sarah over the past few months, every smile, every gesture. How hadn't she seen it before? The way Sarah tilted her head when she was concentrating, identical to Lucia's. Her laughter, which filled the house in a way Elena hadn't experienced in years. Even her way of moving around the house, as if she somehow knew every nook and cranny. Elena rose slowly, her legs still shaky. She walked over to one of the boxes they had been going through before the discovery. With trembling hands, she pulled out a photo album. She opened it, turning the pages until she came to a picture of Lucia on her 5th birthday. There was her little girl, smiling at the camera, her eyes bright with excitement, the small gold hoop earrings gleaming in her ears. The days that followed the discovery in the attic were a whirlwind of emotions for Elena. Every morning she woke up with the hope that Sarah would return, that it hadn't all been a dream concocted by her desperate mind. And every night she went to sleep with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation for what the new day might bring. Elena knew she had to give Sarah time to process everything that had happened. The young woman had promised to return, and Elena clung to that promise like a castaway to a life raft. But the wait was agonizing. To keep her mind occupied and to avoid falling into despair, Elena decided to do what she should have done years ago: thoroughly investigate Lucia's disappearance. With a determination she hadn't felt in decades, she threw herself into the task. The first step was to dust off the old boxes of documents she had stored in the basement. Police reports, newspaper clippings, notes from the private detectives she had hired over the years. It was all there, a painful reminder of the fruitless search that had consumed her life for so long. Elena spread all the documents on the dining room table, creating a timeline of events. She went over every detail, every lead, every dead end they had encountered in their search. But now, with the perspective of time and the new information she had, Elena began to see patterns she had missed before. Lucia's disappearance had occurred on a Saturday afternoon in the city's Central Park. Elena remembered every detail of that day with painful clarity. Lucia had insisted on going to the park to try out the new swing they had installed. Elena had agreed, thinking it would be a good way to spend the Saturday afternoon. Going over the police reports, Elena noticed something she hadn't registered before. Several witnesses had mentioned seeing a young woman talking to Lucia near the swing. At the time, the police had investigated that lead, but it hadn't led to anything concrete. Now Elena wondered if that woman could have had something to do with her daughter's disappearance. With trembling hands, Elena picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. After several rings, a gruff voice answered. "Detective Ramirez speaking." "Detective," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. "This is Elena Montero. I don't know if you remember me." "Mrs. Montero," the detective interrupted, his voice softening. "Of course, I remember you. I've never forgotten your daughter's case. How can I help you?" Elena took a deep breath before continuing. "Detective, I know it's been many years, but I think I've discovered something important about Lucia's disappearance." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before the detective spoke again. "Mrs. Montero, I understand this is difficult for you, but—" "No, detective, listen to me," Elena interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't like the other times. I have evidence, or at least I think I do. I need your help to verify it." Detective Ramirez listened silently as Elena told him about Sarah, the earrings, the coincidences in the dates. When she finished, there was another long silence. "Mrs. Montero," the detective finally said, his voice thick with emotion. This is incredible. If it's true, it could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for all these years. I need you to come down to the station, bring all the documents you have, and if possible, try to convince Sarah to come too. We'll need to run some tests." Elena felt a surge of relief at hearing the detective take her seriously. "Thank you, detective. I'll be there tomorrow morning. As for Sarah, well, she needs time to process all this, but I promise you I'll do everything I can to get her to cooperate with the investigation." After hanging up, Elena stared at the phone in her hand, a mixture of emotions swirling within her. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of real hope. But there was also fear. Fear of being wrong, of it all being a cruel coincidence, and fear of being right, of her Lucia having been so close all this time without her knowing. The next day dawned gray and rainy, as if the weather mirrored the storm of emotions inside Elena. She dressed mechanically, gathered all the documents she had been reviewing, and tucked them into a folder. Before leaving, she paused in front of the hallway mirror, looking at her reflection. The face staring back at her was etched with years of pain and loss, but there was also a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there in a long time. Determination, hope. The drive to the police station was a blur of wet streets and gray buildings. Elena parked her car and sat there for a moment, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. Finally, with the folder of documents clutched tightly to her chest, she got out of the car and entered the building. Detective Ramirez was waiting for her in the reception area. Despite the years that had passed, Elena recognized him immediately. He was grayer, with a few more wrinkles, but his eyes were still the same, kind yet determined. "Mrs. Montero," he greeted her, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. Let's go to my office. We'll be more comfortable there." Elena followed him through a maze of corridors until they reached a small office. The detective gestured for her to sit down and close the door behind them. "All right," he said, sitting down opposite her. "Tell me everything from the beginning. Don't leave out any details, no matter how insignificant they may seem." Elena took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him about how she met Sarah, how the young woman had started working in her house. She described the day in the attic, the moment she saw the earrings, the conversation that followed. The detective listened attentively, making occasional notes. "And these are all the documents I've gathered," Elena concluded, pushing the folder toward the detective. "Police reports, newspaper clippings, everything I could find about Lucia's disappearance." Detective Ramirez. Detective Ramirez opened the folder and began to review the documents, his brow furrowing as he read. "Mrs. Montero," he said, finally looking up, This is quite compelling. The dates match up. Sarah's description fits what Lucia would look like now. And the earrings. Those are especially intriguing." Elena felt her heart quicken. "So you think it could be true? That Sarah could be my Lucia?" The detective leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "It's possible. Very possible, in fact. But we need more than coincidences and hunches. We need concrete evidence." "What kind of evidence?" Elena asked, leaning forward anxiously. "Well, ideally a DNA test," the detective replied. "That would give us a definitive answer. But for that, we'd need Sarah's cooperation." Elena nodded slowly. "She promised she would come back. Said she needed time to process everything. I haven't heard from her since that day in the attic, but I trust she'll keep her promise." Detective Ramirez looked at her sympathetically. "I understand this must be incredibly difficult for you, Mrs. Montero. And for Sarah too, if it turns out to be true. This will change both of your lives completely." "I know," Elena said softly, "and I don't want to pressure her. But after all these years, I need to know the truth. And I think she does too." The detective nodded. "I agree. In the meantime, there are other things we can do. I'm going to officially reopen Lucia's case with this new information. We can re-interview the original witnesses, see if anyone remembers anything else now that time has passed." Elena felt a wave of gratitude toward the detective. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for never giving up." "I didn't give up, Mrs. Montero," the detective replied with a sad smile. "This case, Lucia's case, it's always stayed with me. I always hoped we'd be able to solve it someday." They spent the next few hours going over the old reports, discussing strategies for the new investigation. When Elena finally left the police station, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. She felt exhausted, yet strangely energized. For the first time in years, she felt they were making progress, that they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth about what happened to Lucia. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Detective Ramirez kept Elena updated on every new development in the investigation. They had managed to track down some of the original witnesses and were scheduling new interviews. They were also revisiting old leads that had been dismissed at the time, seeing if any of them took on new meaning in light of the recent discoveries. Elena, on her part, immersed herself in her own investigations. She spent hours at the local library, searching through old newspapers for any news related to missing or found children from the time Lucia had disappeared. She also created a detailed timeline of events, trying to reconstruct every moment of that fateful day at the park. But despite all this activity, There was a void at the center of it all. Sarah. The young woman hadn't contacted Elena since that day in the attic. Elena respected her need for space and time to process everything. But every day that passed without any news from Sarah was torture. One afternoon, while Elena was in the kitchen making tea, the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? With hurried steps, she went to the door and opened it. There on the doorstep stood Sarah. She looked tired and nervous, but there was a determination in her eyes that made Elena's heart fill with hope. "Hello, Mrs. Elena," Sarah said softly. "I'm back, as promised." Elena had to restrain herself from embracing the young woman. Instead, she stepped aside and said, "Come in, please. I was just about to make some tea. Would you like a cup?" Sarah nodded and followed Elena to the kitchen. They sat down at the table, the silence between them thick with tension and expectation. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about all of this. I spoke to my parents, my adoptive parents. They told me everything they knew about how they found me." Elena listened intently, her teacup forgotten in her hands. "They said they found me in Central Park, just like I told you before," Sarah continued. "It was late, almost nighttime. They found me sitting on a bench, crying. I was wearing a tag with my name, Sarah, on it, and I had these earrings." Sarah gently touched the small gold hoops in her ears. Elena felt her heart quickening. It all matched up with what they knew about Lucia's disappearance. "My parents, they told me they searched everywhere, trying to find anyone who knew me, who might be looking for me. But no one came forward. After several days, they decided to adopt me." "Oh, Sarah," Elena said softly. "It must have been so difficult for you, hearing all of this." Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "It was. It is. It's like my whole life has been a lie. But at the same time, I always felt like something was missing, you know? Like there was a void inside me I couldn't explain." Elena reached out her hand across the table, offering it to Sarah. After a moment of hesitation, the young woman took it. "Sarah," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly, "I know this is a lot to process. And I want you to know that no matter what happens, you have no obligation to me. But would you be willing to do a DNA test so we can know the truth, once and for all?" Sarah stared at her for a long moment, a battle of emotions playing out in her eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said quietly but firmly. "Yes, I think I need to know. We need to know." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for being so brave." The day dawned gray and rainy, as if the sky itself shared the anxiety Elena felt in her heart. Today was the day. Today, after weeks of agonizing waiting, they would receive the DNA test results. Today, they would finally know the truth. Elena had barely slept the night before. She had spent hours tossing and turning in bed, her mind a whirlwind of memories, hopes, and fears. What if the test was positive? What if Sarah really was her Lucia? The thought filled her with such intense joy it almost hurt. But there was also fear. Fear that it was all a cruel mistake, that the test would be negative, and she would have to face the loss of her daughter once again. She got up early, unable to bear another minute in bed. As she was making her morning coffee, her eyes fell on the photograph of Lucia that now occupied a prominent place in the kitchen. She had taken it out of the attic after that fateful day, unable to keep it hidden away any longer. "Today we'll know, my girl," Elena whispered to the photograph. "Today we'll know if I finally found you." The doorbell startled her, making her spill some coffee on the counter. Heart pounding, Elena rushed to open the door. Sarah stood there, her face pale and tense, but with a determination in her eyes that Elena recognized. It was the same determination she felt. "Good morning, Mrs. Elena," Sarah said softly. "I hope I'm not too early." Elena shook her head, stepping aside to let the young woman in. "Not at all, dear. I haven't been able to sleep much either." They walked to the kitchen in silence. Elena poured Sarah a cup of coffee, which she accepted with a murmured "thank you." They sat down at the table, the ticking of the wall clock deafening in the tense silence. "What time did Detective Ramirez say he would have the results?" Sarah asked, finally breaking the silence. Elena glanced at the clock. "He said he'd call us around 10. It's 45 minutes away." Sarah nodded, her fingers nervously playing with the handle of her cup. Mrs. Elena, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I want you to know that no matter what happens today, I'm grateful. Grateful for having met you, for everything you've done for me. Elena felt tears pricking her eyes. She reached across the table, taking Sarah's hand in hers. Oh dear, I'm the one who should be grateful. You've brought light into my life, Sarah, regardless of what that test says. They stayed like that, hands clasped on the table, the silence between them now charged with emotion and mutual understanding. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Elena and Sarah spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. At 9:55, Elena's phone rang, startling them both. It was Detective Ramirez. Mrs. Montero, he said, his voice serious. I have the results. I'd prefer to discuss them in person. Can you and Sarah come down to the station? Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Of course, Detective. We'll be right there. She hung up and looked at Sarah, who was watching her with wide, frightened eyes. It was the detective, Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. He wants us to come to the station. He has the results. Sarah nodded, rising to her feet on shaky legs. Let's go then. The drive to the police station was a blur of wet streets and traffic lights. Elena drove on autopilot, her mind too preoccupied with what awaited them to pay any real attention to the road. Sarah, sitting in the passenger seat, stared out the window silently, her reflection in the glass showing a mixture of fear and anticipation. When they arrived at the police station, Detective Ramirez was waiting for them at the entrance, his face unreadable. Elena felt her anxiety spike. He led them to his office in silence, closing the door behind them. Please sit down, the detective said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. Elena and Sarah obeyed, their bodies tense, their hands unconsciously intertwining, seeking each other's support. Detective Ramirez sat down opposite them, a sealed manila envelope in his hands. He looked at it for a moment before raising his eyes to meet theirs. Before I open this, he began, his voice soft but firm, I want both of you to understand something. Whatever the results are, it doesn't change who you are. Sarah, you're still the same wonderful person you've always been. And you, Mrs. Montero, are still the strong, courageous woman who has fought all these years. Do you understand? Both women were too choked with emotion to speak. Detective Ramirez nodded, satisfied. Then, with deliberately slow movements, he opened the envelope and pulled out a sheet of paper. He read it silently, his face impassive. Elena felt like her heart was going to burst. Every passing second was torture. Beside her, she could feel Sarah trembling slightly. Finally, the detective looked up from the paper. He glanced at Elena, then at Sarah, and then back at Elena. Mrs. Montero, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Sarah, the DNA test is conclusive. There is a 99.9% probability that you are mother and daughter. The world seemed to stop. Elena heard the words, but her mind refused to fully process them. Beside her, Sarah let out a choked sob. What? Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. Are you sure? Detective Ramirez nodded, a smile slowly spreading across his face. Completely sure. Mrs. Montero, Sarah is your daughter. Sarah is Lucia. And with those words, reality finally hit Elena. A heart-wrenching sob escaped her throat, and before she could even think, she had enveloped Sarah, Lucia, in a fierce embrace. My girl, she cried, stroking Sarah's hair. My Lucia, I found you. I finally found you. Sarah, Lucia, wept openly, her arms tightening around Elena. Mom, she whispered between sobs. Mom. Detective Ramirez watched them, tears in his own eyes, giving them this moment of reunion they had waited for so long. It was several minutes before Elena and Lucia could calm down enough to pull apart. They looked at each other, really looked at each other, as if seeing each other for the first time. I can't believe it, Lucia said, wiping her tears. All these years, and I was so close. Elena nodded, unable to stop touching her daughter, as if she feared she would disappear if she let go. I know, my love. I know. But now you're here. You're safe. You're home. Detective Ramirez cleared his throat softly. I know this is an overwhelming moment for both of you, he said, but there's a lot we need to discuss about what happened 20 years ago, about how we proceed from here. Elena and Lucia nodded, turning towards the detective, but without letting go of each other's hands. The first thing you should know, the detective continued, is that we have officially reopened the case of Lucia's disappearance. With this new information, and with Lucia's help, he paused, smiling at the young woman, we hope to finally find out what happened that day in the park. Lucia frowned, a look of concentration on her face. I don't remember much about that day, she said slowly. My first clear memories are from when I was with my adoptive parents. But sometimes I have these flashes, these images I don't understand. Elena squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. I remember a swing, Lucia said, closing her eyes as if trying to visualize the scene. And a young woman with blonde hair. She was talking to me, but I can't remember what she was saying. Detective Ramirez nodded, scribbling notes. That matches the witness statements we had from that day. Several people mentioned seeing a young blonde woman talking to a little girl near the swings. Elena felt her heart race. You think that woman could have been responsible for Lucia's disappearance? It's a possibility we're looking into, the detective replied. With the description Lucia has just provided, we can reopen some leads we had previously dismissed. Lucia looked at Elena, then at the detective. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Detective Ramirez regarded her with sympathy. Well, legally, your situation is complicated. You were legally adopted, although under circumstances we now know were erroneous. We'll need to work with lawyers to resolve your legal status. Elena felt a stab of fear. But they can't take her away from me again, can they? Now that we know the truth? No, don't worry, Mrs. Montero, the detective reassured her. No one is going to take Lucia away from you, but we need to make sure everything is done correctly from a legal standpoint. Lucia nodded slowly. My adoptive parents, what will happen to them? The detective looked at her with understanding. I understand this must be very difficult for you, Lucia. Your adoptive parents raised you, loved you, all these years. They're not guilty of any crime. They genuinely believed they were adopting an abandoned child. We'll have to talk to them, of course, but they're not in any legal trouble. Lucia seemed to relax a little at these words. Elena, noticing her relief, felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, she was immensely grateful to the people who had cared for and loved her daughter all these years. On the other, she couldn't help feeling a pang of jealousy, of heartache for all the moments she had missed. Lucia, she said softly, turning to look her daughter in the eye. I want you to know that I understand how hard this must be for you. Your adoptive parents are your family, and they always will be. I don't want to take that away from you. I just want the opportunity to get to know you, to be a part of your life. Lucia looked at her, her eyes welling up again. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know how to handle all of this. I love my adoptive parents, but I always felt like something was missing in my life. And now I've found you, Mom. Elena felt her heart swell with love at hearing Lucia call her Mom. It was a dream come true, a moment she had imagined countless times over the years. Detective Ramirez watched them, a gentle smile on his face. I know you have a lot to talk about, a lot to process, he said. But for now, I think you should go home. Get some rest. We can meet again tomorrow to discuss the next steps in the investigation. Elena and Lucia nodded, rising to their feet. Before leaving the office, Elena turned back to the detective. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for never giving up. Detective Ramirez smiled. It's been an honor to be a part of this, Mrs. Montero. To see a mother and daughter reunited after so long. This is why I do this job. They left the police station hand in hand, as if afraid to separate now that they had finally found each other. The sky had cleared, and a timid sun peeked through the clouds, as if nature itself celebrated their reunion. Do you want to come home with me? Elena asked timidly as they approached the car. I understand if you'd rather go to your own place. If you need some time, Lucia interrupted her with a soft smile. I'd love to come home with you, Mom. I think we have a lot to talk about.